In my past life, I was Su Ci, a data analyst who died face down in a spreadsheet at 2 in the morning. My last conscious thought was I should really drink some water. My second to last conscious thought was a formula error in cell G47. There was no white light, no smiling deity handing me a system interface and a cheat code protagonist package. No, congratulations, you have been selected for reincarnation. Please choose your talent tree. There was just darkness, and then there was fur. Specifically, my own fur, which I discovered when I tried to rub my eyes and instead smacked myself in the face with a paw the size of a teacup saucer. Okay, I said or tried to say. What came out was a small, undignified yip. I looked down at myself, a maneuver that required significantly more spinal flexibility than I remembered having as a human, and which I executed with alarming ease, and found 4 white paws, a body covered in what I can only describe as criminally soft silver-gray fur, and when I twisted around to check, not 1 but 9 fluffy tails fanned out behind me like some kind of anxiety-induced peacock display. I was a fox, a small one, a baby one, judging by the way my legs wobbled when I tried to stand, like a newborn deer that had made several poor life choices. This, I informed the empty stone chamber I appeared to be in, is not what I meant when I said I wanted a career change. Nobody answered. There was no narrator voice, no system prompt, no helpful exposition fairy. Just me, 9 tails, and the dawning horror that I was going to have to figure out the rules of this world through trial and error like some kind of caveman. I want to be very clear, I did not ask for this. I did not read a web novel about transmigrating into a cultivation world and think, ah yes, sign me up. I read spreadsheets. I optimized supply chains. My idea of an adventure was finding parking on the first try. And yet here I was, apparently a 9-tailed spirit fox, in what I would later learn was the private garden shrine of the great Xuan dynasty's imperial palace, about to become the most inconvenient pet in the history of inconvenient pets. I spent approximately 4 hours doing what any reasonable adult would do in this situation. Panicking quietly, testing my new body's limits. I could apparently see in the dark, which was cool, and I could apparently not form human words, which was extremely not cool, and eating a suspicious-looking beetle because my fox instincts insisted it was food, and my human brain arrived at that conclusion approximately 1 second too late to stop me. It was, for the record, not food, or rather it was food, but I regretted it immediately and at length. I was mid-regret when the ground began to shake, not literally, but in the way that precedes very important people, a kind of anticipatory dread that travels through servants and guards like a rumor with legs. I heard voices, boots, the unmistakable rustle of many, many people trying to look busy and reverent at the same time. And then the shrine doors opened, and a man walked in wearing black and gold robes that probably cost more than my old apartment, with a face like a sculptor had been commissioned to carve devastatingly handsome and please do not speak to me into the same block of marble. I would later learn this was Emperor Mu Zhan, ruler of the great Xuan dynasty, conqueror of the western passes, the man 3 separate rebellions had failed to kill, and according to every rumor I would overhear in the following months, someone who had once had a minister executed for bringing him the wrong tea. At the time, all I knew was, big scary man, very fancy, currently staring directly at me with an expression I could not read. I did the only thing that seemed reasonable. I froze completely and prayed to whatever cosmic authority had put me here that playing dead was a viable strategy against apex predators wearing crowns. It was not. He crossed the room in 4 strides, crouched down in front of me, an act that seemed to cause the entire retinue behind him to collectively stop breathing, and looked at me with the focused intensity of a man defusing a bomb. A fox, he said. His voice was low and even, the kind of voice that had probably ordered executions in the same tone it now used to state the obvious, in the ancestral shrine. No kidding, I thought, and then immediately worried that thinking sarcastic things might somehow be detectable, because I had absolutely no idea how any of this worked. "Your Majesty," said a voice from the doorway, an older man in eunuch robes, wringing his hands so hard I was surprised they didn't squeak. This, I'd later learn, was Fu Gui, chief eunuch and the palace's foremost expert in reading the room. The astronomers reported a falling star over the shrine 3 nights past, perhaps this creature. "An omen," said someone else. This voice was drier, more clipped, radiating the specific energy of a man who filed complaints for a hobby. Minister Zhou Heng, as I'd come to know him, standing stiffly with his hands folded into his sleeves like he was personally offended by my existence. or a demon. Your Majesty, wild animals in the ancestral shrine are inauspicious. It should be removed, possibly destroyed as a precaution. I would like the record to show that I did not appreciate this suggestion. The Emperor did not look away from me. It has 9 tails, he said. Yes, Your Majesty, Fugui said carefully. Spirit foxes with 9 tails are said to be creatures of great fortune. The Emperor reached out one hand, and I want to stress that every instinct in my fox body screamed, bite it now, that's a predator's hand, and instead of biting it, I found myself, against every ounce of dignity I had left, leaning into it. Traitor body, I thought, as his fingers found the exact spot behind my ear that turned my 9 tails into a single blissful puddle of fluff. We do not do this, we have standards. My standards, it turned out, were made of tissue paper because 30 seconds later I was purring. Foxes should not be able to purr, I want to note, and yet, while an actual tyrant scratched my ears in front of his entire cowering court. It stays, the Emperor announced in the tone of a man closing a business meeting. Have it fed, have it bathed, it will reside in my quarters. Minister Zhou Heng made a sound like a man swallowing his own tongue. Your Majesty, a wild creature in the imperial bedchamber is. Zhou Heng, the Emperor did not raise his voice, he did not need to. Do you have further objections? No, Your Majesty. Good. The Emperor scooped me up one arm like I weighed nothing, which, to be fair, I probably didn't, and settled me against his chest with a casualness that suggested he'd already decided this was simply how things were going to be from now on. It needs a name. Your Majesty is very fond of it already, Fu Gui observed, in the careful voice of a man who has learned to narrate his master's feelings back to him as though this counts as flattery rather than commentary. The Emperor looked down at me. I looked up at him, doing my level best to project dignified fox and almost certainly achieving concussed marshmallow instead. Tuanzi, he said. Dumpling, I thought, he's calling me Dumpling. I have been a fox for 4 hours, and the ruler of an empire has decided my name is Dumpling. An excellent name, Your Majesty, said Fu Gui, because apparently that's just what you say. I would like to formally state, for whatever cosmic record is keeping track of these things, that I objected. Internally. Extremely internally, because the alternative was biting the most powerful man in the empire on the finger during our first meeting, and I had a vague sense that even a spirit fox probably didn't get away with that twice. And that is the story of how Su Ci, mid-level data analyst, became Tuanzi, imperial pet fox, in under a single afternoon. Chapter 2, Adjusting to Unemployment, Fox Edition. The first thing I learned about being Emperor Mu Zhan's pet was that the man had absolutely no sense of scale. My new quarters, because apparently I had quarters now, an entire corner of the imperial bedchamber devoted to a single fox, included a sleeping cushion large enough to fit 3 of me, upholstered in silk so fine I felt guilty putting paws on it. There was a food bowl carved from what I strongly suspected was jade. There was a water fountain gently trickling because someone had decided a fox's water needed ambience. This is insane, I told Xiao Lu, the young eunuch assigned to my care on my second day. What came out was a series of yips and one aggressive sneeze because I still hadn't figured out how to make actual words happen. Xiao Lu, who could not have been older than 16, just beamed at me like I'd said something delightful. His Majesty had the fountain installed overnight, Xiao Lu confided, dropping his voice like we were sharing a secret, even though I was, biologically, incapable of repeating it to anyone. He asked 3 separate craftsmen whether foxes preferred flowing water or standing water. He read a treatise. I stared at him. He does not read treatises for anyone, Xiao Lu added, with the reverent awe of a teenager who has just witnessed a celebrity do something normal. Chief Eunuch Fu Gui says His Majesty once had a treatise on flood management burned because it was, quote, too long. I processed this information the way I processed most things in those early days, with a slow, dawning sense that I had transmigrated into a genre I did not fully understand the rules of. Here is what I knew about Emperor Mu Zhan after 1 week of extremely close observation, most of it conducted from the vantage point of his lap, which was apparently just where I lived now. He was, by all external accounts, a tyrant. He had conquered 3 border kingdoms before the age of 25. Ministers went pale when summoned to his study. There was a particular set to his jaw that made entire rooms of armed men take one collective step backward. He was also the kind of man who, upon learning that foxes liked warmth, had a heated stone installed under my cushion, and then personally checked the temperature with his own hand every evening to make sure it wasn't too hot, muttering things like acceptable and still needs adjustment to himself as though this were a matter of state. I did not know what to do with this information. My old life had not prepared me for emotionally attentive tyrant. My old life had prepared me for quarterly reviews and a manager named Kevin who forgot my name twice a year. "You're staring at me again," the Emperor said one evening, not looking up from the scroll he was reading. I had in fact been staring at him, specifically at the furrow between his eyebrows, which appeared whenever he read reports about grain shortages in the eastern provinces, and which smoothed out almost involuntarily whenever he glanced over at me. I made a noise that I hoped conveyed no, I wasn't, and definitely conveyed yes, I absolutely was. He reached over without looking and scratched behind my ears, and I hated how immediately my entire body melted into the touch like I hadn't been touched by another living thing in months, which, to be fair, as a soul recently ejected from a corporate cubicle and deposited into a fox body, I hadn't. "You're a strange fox," he murmured. "Most creatures flinch from me." I wanted to say something. I wanted to say, "Sir, you have a documented body count and a face that could stop a war, of course they flinch." What I actually did was headbutt his hand, demanding more ear scratches because apparently that was the only vocabulary I had left. He laughed. It was a short, surprised sound like it had escaped before he could catch it, and Fu Gui, hovering by the door with an armful of scrolls, nearly dropped everything he was carrying. "Your Majesty," Fu Gui said faintly, "that is the third time this week." "Was it?" the Emperor said, in a tone that suggested he knew exactly how many times it had been and was daring anyone to comment further. Nobody commented further. I personally filed this away under interesting data and went back to demanding ear scratches, because whatever else was going on here, I had quickly discovered that being a spoiled palace fox came with genuinely excellent benefits, and I was not about to let my human dignity get in the way of a good ear scratch. My dignity, as it turned out, would face significantly bigger tests than that. Chapter 3: The Dawn Court Incident, or How I Learned That Ministers Can, in fact, Turn That Shade of Purple. I found out about Dawn Court the hard way, which is to say, I was carried into it. It began, as these things often do, with the Emperor simply deciding something and everyone else being expected to catch up. I woke at some ungodly pre-dawn hour to find myself being lifted, gently, but with zero room for negotiation, from my cushion and tucked into the crook of his arm like a very large, very unimpressed loaf of bread. "Where are we going?" I tried to communicate through a series of increasingly betrayed yips. "Court," the Emperor said, as though this explained anything, and strode out of the bedchamber with me still half asleep against his chest. I would like to describe in detail the exact facial expression of 200 assembled ministers when the emperor of the great Xuan dynasty walked into the dawn assembly holding a fox. Minister Zhou Heng, I am fairly sure, briefly stopped functioning as a biological organism. His face went through no fewer than 4 colors: pale, red, a concerning shade of purple, and then a kind of resigned gray, before he managed to speak. "Your Majesty," he said in the strangled voice of a man who has picked this exact battle before and lost, "the fox in court." "Yes," the Emperor agreed, settling into the throne with the casual air of a man who did not see the problem, and adjusting his hold on me so I was tucked more comfortably against his ribs, tails and all. "It gets anxious alone." This was, for the record, an outrageous lie. I did not get anxious alone. I had, in my past life, spent entire weekends alone with a bag of chips and a laptop and considered it a personal triumph. But apparently the Emperor's fox has abandonment issues was a more palatable explanation than "I simply enjoy holding my fox in answer to no one," so here we were. I want to be extremely clear about how this looked from the outside. I was draped over the arm of the dragon throne like a particularly smug throw blanket, while 200 of the Empire's most powerful men tried to conduct matters of state. Every single one of them was doing their absolute best to pretend this was normal. None of them were succeeding. The grain reports from the eastern provinces," stammered one official, a thin man clutching his scroll like it might save him from whatever was happening, "indicate a surplus of." He trailed off because I had chosen that exact moment to yawn hugely, showing every single one of my very small, very sharp fox teeth, and the poor man visibly lost his train of thought entirely. Continue, the emperor said without so much as glancing at him, one hand idly stroking down my back in a rhythm that I am ashamed to admit I had started, unconsciously, matching my breathing to. I need to establish some boundaries, I thought, even as my tails thumped once softly against the armrest in pure traitorous contentment. This is a war room. I am compromising national security by being this comfortable. The meeting continued in this fashion, officials reporting on floods and taxes and border skirmishes, while attempting to maintain professional composure in the presence of a snoozing fox draped over their emperor's forearm, until Minister Zhou Heng, apparently having reached some kind of internal breaking point, cleared his throat with the force of a man about to commit career suicide. "Your Majesty," he said, "with respect, is it truly necessary for the animal to attend matters of state?" The temperature of the room dropped several degrees. I felt the emperor's hand still against my fur. "Zhou Heng," the emperor said pleasantly in the exact tone I imagined he used right before someone got demoted to guarding a well in the provinces, "are you suggesting I do not know how to run my own court?" "And no, Your Majesty, only that. Tuanzi," the emperor said, "has better instincts than half this room. It bit the sleeve of the tribute envoy from Yan last month, moments before we discovered the tribute gifts were counterfeit." This was, I should clarify, mostly true, though the actual sequence of events had been. The envoy's silk sleeve smelled faintly of a specific dye I recognized from 3 years of supply chain auditing in my old life, a dye known for being used in cheap counterfeit textiles, and I had bitten him out of pure instinctive outrage at witnessing fraud in progress. The fact that this had also correctly predicted the tribute gifts were fake was, frankly, a coincidence that I was choosing to accept credit for. "A remarkable creature," Fu Gui offered helpfully, from his position by the throne. Zhou Heng opened his mouth, visibly reconsidered every choice that had led him to this moment, and closed it again. "Of course, Your Majesty," he said, and sat back down with the air of a man filing this away for a very long list of grievances he would never actually voice again. I would love to say I felt bad about this. I did not. Zhou Heng had suggested on day one that I be destroyed as a precaution, and I am nothing if not a fox who holds a grudge. The meeting resumed. I fell back asleep against the emperor's arm because apparently being a beloved imperial pet involved excellent naps, and if 200 terrified officials had to conduct the business of an empire around my nap schedule, then frankly, that was a them problem. Chapter 4, in which I discover I have rivals and one of them has claws. Not everyone in the palace was thrilled about my rapid rise to most favored creature in the realm. The first rival I met was Da Bao, the palace's reigning cat, an enormous orange tom who had, until my arrival, held the undisputed title of Emperor's favorite animal for approximately 6 years, and who made his feelings about my usurpation extremely clear the moment we were introduced. "This," Xiao Lu explained, holding Da Bao at what I can only describe as a respectful distance, "is Da Bao. He used to sleep on His Majesty's desk during work hours." Da Bao looked at me with the flat, murderous contempt of a mid-level manager who has just been passed over for a promotion in favor of an intern. He did not hiss. He did not need to. His entire posture communicated with devastating clarity, "I have been here for 6 years and you have been here for 6 days." I attempted diplomacy, in the form of a friendly tail wag. Da Bao swatted me across the nose and stalked off with the wounded dignity of royalty in exile. "He'll come around," Xiao Lu said, with the misplaced optimism of someone who has clearly never managed office politics. Da Bao did not in fact come around, not for several weeks, during which he engaged in what I can only describe as a campaign of low-grade psychological warfare. He knocked my water bowl over exactly once a day, always when I wasn't looking. He commandeered the sunniest spot on the windowsill the instant I so much as glanced at it. Once, memorably, he managed to get himself photographed, well, painted, this being ancient China and not having photography, sitting in the emperor's lap during an official portrait sitting that had been scheduled, pointedly, for a time I was usually napping. I want to state for the record that I found this deeply annoying and also, somewhere in the depths of my very confused fox-human psyche, extremely relatable, because I too had once been the office's reigning senior analyst before a new hire named Jessica got the corner desk, and I understood exactly the kind of grief Da Bao was processing. The thaw began, as these things often do, by accident. It was a rainy afternoon, and I had wandered, as much as a fox confined mostly to the imperial quarters can wander, into the side courtyard, where I discovered De Bao crouched under an eave, thoroughly soaked, one paw held awkwardly aloft. He'd caught it on something, a splinter, maybe, or a thorn from the rose bushes the gardeners were forever fussing over. He was hissing at it like the injury had personally insulted him. I had two options here. Option 1, leave him to his suffering, in keeping with our established rivalry, and return to my very nice heated cushion. Option 2, get involved, despite every professional instinct honed by years of not my department telling me to walk away. Reader, I am ashamed to say that 6 days of unemployment as a human being had apparently not cured me of caring about problems that weren't technically mine. I approached carefully because an injured animal is still an animal with claws, and I had no interest in losing an eye over this. De Bao hissed at me on principle, then winced, then, grudgingly, the way you'd accept help from a coworker you were still mad at, let me nose at his paw. It was mercifully just a thorn. I couldn't exactly perform surgery with fox teeth, but I could apparently herd. I nudged him insistently in the direction of the covered walkway that led back toward the physician's quarters, ignoring his protesting yowls the entire way, until he finally huffed and stalked ahead of me under his own power, presumably to preserve what remained of his dignity. Physician Tang extracted the thorn with a pair of tiny silver tweezers, muttering the whole time about how this cat has never once cooperated for an examination. What's different today? While De Bao sat with his paw out and his eyes narrowed at me like he suspected I'd engineered the whole thing just to make him look weak. That night I found him curled up on the far edge of my ridiculous, oversized cushion, not touching me, mind you, several respectful inches away, but there. Don't get used to this, I tried to communicate, via a single unimpressed tail flick. De Bao flicked his tail back in what I chose to interpret as the feeling is mutual, dumpling. We were from that night forward something like colleagues, not friends exactly. Colleagues who had weathered a shared minor crisis and now tolerated each other's presence with the specific weary camaraderie of two employees who both know the real enemy is upper management, or in this case the actively scheming members of the imperial harem, which brings me to the far less charming rival I acquired shortly after. Chapter 5. Noble Consort Lion Yaoi would like me gone, preferably permanently. Noble Consort Lion Yaoi was, by every external measure, the picture of imperial elegance, silk robes in deep plum, hair ornamented with gold that caught the light just so, a voice pitched to a musical softness that I distrusted on principle within about 4 seconds of meeting her. I distrusted her further when I realized her softness only ever appeared in front of the emperor, and vanished entirely the instant his back was turned. "What a charming creature," she said, the first time we were introduced, crouching down with a smile that did not reach her eyes and extending one hand toward me with the delicate reluctance of a woman who has never once wanted to touch an animal in her life, but understands the optics require it. I did not bite her, I want that on the record, because every instinct I had screamed at me to bite her, and I showed remarkable restraint. "He seems fond of you," the emperor observed from his seat nearby, watching with the mild, distracted attention of a man who was really only in the room because I was. "I am fond of anything your majesty holds dear," Lion Yaoi said, in a tone so sugared it made my fox teeth ache. I made a note filed under "this woman is trouble" and went back to studiously ignoring her hand until she withdrew it, jaw tight beneath her composed smile. I want to be clear that court intrigue in this world operated at a level of subtlety my old corporate life had genuinely not prepared me for. In my past life, office politics meant someone stealing your idea in a meeting, or your manager taking credit for your quarterly report. Here it meant a woman who smiled sweetly at you while, I would later learn, quietly bribing the kitchen staff to accidentally leave certain doors unlocked. It started small, a missing cushion, a misplaced bowl of my food that turned up 3 hours later, tipped over and spoiled, with an innocent explanation about a clumsy servant that nobody quite believed but nobody quite challenged either. I noticed because noticing patterns in messy data had literally been my old job, and a fox's nose is, it turns out, an extraordinarily good instrument for noticing when something smells wrong. The real trouble came during the mid-autumn banquet. It was a lavish affair, the entire court gathered in the main hall, lanterns strung overhead, more food than I had seen assembled in one place in either of my lives. The emperor, as had become his habit, kept a small dish set aside specifically for me, delivered personally by Xiao Lu, who took his duties with the gravity of a man handling state secrets. I was about to eat when something stopped me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a glowing warning sign or a system alert. It was just a smell, faint and bitter beneath the honeyed glaze of the sweet rice cake, the kind of smell my old analyst brain associated with sudden cold clarity from a poisoning case study I'd read for absolutely no reason years ago in a completely unrelated context, the way your brain hoards useless trivia and then produces it at the worst possible moment. Wolfsbane, or something close enough to it that every fox instinct in my body was screaming, "Do not eat this," backing up whatever half-remembered human knowledge I had. I didn't eat it. Instead, I did something considerably more dramatic. I knocked the entire dish off the low table with one deliberate swipe of my paw, sending it clattering across the polished floor in front of the entire assembled court, and then, for good measure, I turned and bit, gently but pointedly, at the Emperor's sleeve, tugging. The hall went quiet. This was, by now, familiar. The hall tended to go quiet whenever I did anything even slightly unusual, because 200 people had collectively decided that the Emperor's fox was either an omen or an oracle and hadn't settled on which. The Emperor looked down at the spilled dish, then at me, then, with the sharp, assessing focus of a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts and had learned, the hard way, to trust unusual patterns, at the dish again. "Physician Tang," he said, without raising his voice, which was somehow more alarming than shouting would have been, "examine this." The hall's quiet turned into a different, much more charged kind of quiet. It took Physician Tang exactly 4 minutes to confirm what my fox nose had already told me. The rice cake had been laced with a compound that, while not immediately lethal in the small dose meant for one fox, would have caused several hours of severe illness that conveniently would have occurred directly after I ate from a dish handled, that evening, specifically by 2 new kitchen attendants who had been recommended for the position by, as it emerged under some remarkably swift and thorough investigation, a certain noble consort. I would love to tell you Lion Yaoi confessed dramatically on the spot, weeping and cursing the day she crossed paths with a fox smarter than her entire scheme. What actually happened was considerably more mundane and honestly more satisfying. She went very pale, claimed total ignorance, blamed the attendants, and was escorted from the banquet hall with a composure so brittle I half expected it to crack audibly. The 2 attendants, faced with the prospect of taking the fall entirely alone for a scheme that was very much not their idea, did not hold up nearly as well under questioning. "You knew," the Emperor said to me later that night, back in the quiet of his quarters, sitting on the edge of the bed with me settled in his lap while Fu Gui hovered nearby looking faintly traumatized by the evening's events. "You knew before it happened." I did the fox equivalent of a shrug, which mostly involved flattening my ears and looking deeply unbothered. "Remarkable," he said, quiet almost to himself, one hand smoothing down my back in that same slow rhythm that always made my traitorous fox heart settle. "Sometimes I think you understand every word I say." "You have no idea," I thought, with the specific, weary affection of someone whose secret was getting progressively harder to keep. "Also, side note, your noble consort just tried to poison me, and you're currently one confession away from finding out I have opinions about your grain policy." I said none of this, obviously, because I still could not form words, and instead did what any self-respecting fox would do after surviving an assassination attempt. I climbed further into his lap, tucked my nose under his chin, and let him hold me until he stopped, almost imperceptibly, shaking. I hadn't noticed until that moment that he'd been afraid. Chapter 6: Tender Moments I Did Not Consent to, an ongoing list. "Look, I need to talk about the bathing thing. Nobody warns you when you transmigrate into a fox that the man you're living with is going to personally supervise your baths. I assumed, reasonably I think, that this task would fall to Xiao Lu or some other member of the extensive palace staff whose entire job description was, presumably, handle the fox. Instead, roughly once a week, I would find myself deposited into a wide copper basin of warm water, with the emperor of the great Xuan dynasty rolling up his sleeves like a man settling into a task he took, inexplicably, quite seriously. "Your Majesty," Fu Gui had said, the very first time this happened, in the strangled tone of a man who has decided some battles are simply not worth fighting, there are attendants specifically trained for. "I am aware," the Emperor said, and continued rolling up his sleeves. "I want to describe, with as much dignity as I can muster in retrospect, exactly how undignified it is to be a grown man's soul trapped inside a fox body, while said grown man very carefully works soap through your fur, muttering things like 'hold still,' and you're getting worse than the last minister who argued with me, in a tone of voice that somehow managed to be both threatening and unmistakably fond. I splashed him repeatedly. It felt like the only appropriate response. He splashed me back once with the exact deadpan seriousness of a man declaring war, and then looked so genuinely startled by his own action that I nearly choked on bathwater laughing, well yipping since fox laughter and fox joking apparently sound identical, which led to several minutes of him anxiously checking me over for signs of distress while I tried, and failed to communicate that I was fine. I was just deeply amused. "You have the strangest sense of humor for a fox," he said, toweling me off afterward with a level of care that made my chest do something complicated and unwelcome. I did not have a response to this because I was too busy having a small internal crisis about the fact that I was, against every professional instinct I'd cultivated across 2 entire lifetimes, developing feelings. It wasn't just the baths. It was the way he read reports aloud sometimes, late at night, not because I could offer input as far as he knew, but because, as he put it once, half asleep and unguarded in a way I suspected almost nobody else in the Empire ever got to see, it's easier to think out loud to something that won't repeat it to the wrong person. It was the way it started leaving certain decisions, until after I'd woken from my afternoon nap, as though my presence made the choices easier. It was the way on the anniversary of his father's death, a day I learned about only because the entire palace fell into a hush I could feel before anyone explained it. He sat alone in the garden pavilion for hours, not eating, not speaking, until I climbed uninvited into his lap and simply stayed there, and something in his shoulders finally eased. "I don't know why I tell you anything," he murmured into my fur that afternoon. "You're a fox." I'm a very good listener, all things considered, I thought, and pressed closer, because apparently I had become the kind of creature who did that now, dignity be damned. It was, if I'm being honest with myself, and being trapped in a fox body with nothing but your own thoughts for company does encourage a certain amount of brutal self-honesty, somewhere around the 3rd or 4th of these moments that I started to suspect I was in genuine trouble. Not court intrigue trouble. Worse, feelings trouble. I had transmigrated into a Xianxia web novel as a pet fox, and I was, God help me, falling for the tyrant. Chapter 7: The Chess Incident, or How I Almost Blew My Own Cover Over a Board Game. I wanted on record that the chess incident was not my fault. It was, if anything, the Emperor's fault for being bad enough at strategy games that I simply could not sit there and watch him lose to Minister Zhou Heng without intervening. It happened during an evening of what the court called leisure, which for the Emperor mostly meant working in a slightly more relaxed posture. Zhou Heng, who, despite our rocky start, had apparently decided that beating the Emperor at chess was an acceptable outlet for whatever grievances he still harbored about the whole Fox and Dawn court situation, had set up a board, and the 2 of them had settled in for what was, by all appearances, going to be a long and painful loss for my Emperor. I was curled at his side, ostensibly asleep, actually watching the board with the intense focus of a man who had once been mediocre at chess in his old life, but had spent an embarrassing number of lonely evenings studying strategy guides during a breakup several years prior that I would rather not discuss further. The Emperor was about to make a catastrophic error. I could see it 3 moves out, the kind of move that looked clever in the moment and led, inexorably, to a cornered king within 6 turns. I did not mean to intervene, I want to be extremely clear about that. But my paw was resting near the edge of the board, and when he reached for the piece that would doom him, some old, half-forgotten competitive instinct from my past life simply took over, and I smacked his hand gently but unmistakably away from the piece, and instead nudged with great deliberateness an entirely different piece 2 spaces to the left. The room went very still. Zhou Heng stared at the board, then at me, then at the board again, with the expression of a man recalculating an entire strategy in real time. "Your Majesty," he said slowly, "did your fox just—" "Coincidence," the Emperor said, but I noticed he did not move his hand back to the original piece. Instead, after a long pause, he moved the piece I'd indicated. 6 moves later, Zhou Heng's king was in fact cornered. I would like to say I felt triumphant. What I actually felt was a rising, cold panic, because the Emperor was now looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen before, not fondness, not amusement, but a sharp, focused attention, the kind of look I imagined he gave enemy troop formations before a battle. "Interesting," he said very quietly, and I understood, with the sudden clarity of a man realizing he'd left the oven on 3 states away, that I had made a significant mistake. I spent the next several days doing what I can only describe as an aggressive campaign of playing dumb. I accidentally fell off cushions. I chased my own tail with theatrical enthusiasm. And Physician Tang was called in at the emperor's request, ostensibly for a routine checkup, but with an undertone of let's see what this creature actually is that I did not appreciate. I responded to a series of increasingly elaborate tests by failing to complete even the simplest ones, batting a treat off a table instead of retrieving it, staring blankly at a mirror instead of reacting to my own reflection like a sensible spirit fox with self-awareness would. He seems perfectly ordinary, Your Majesty, Physician Tang concluded, sounding almost disappointed, and I nearly wept with relief. The emperor did not look entirely convinced, but he let it go outwardly, at least, and I told myself with the specific, hollow confidence of a man lying to himself for his own comfort that I had successfully avoided disaster. I had not accounted for the fact that letting it go outwardly and actually letting it go were, for a man like Emperor Muzhan, two very different things. Chapter 8, a complication named He Already Suspects, Doesn't He? It came to a head, as these things tend to, at the worst possible moment. There had been rumblings for weeks, not the domestic sort this time but real ones, the kind that made the emperor's jaw set in a way I'd come to recognize as someone is about to lose their head over this. A faction within the western garrison, dissatisfied with new tax reforms, had begun what the reports delicately called consolidating irregular loyalties, which was, translated out of bureaucratic euphemism, treason in progress. The emperor rode out with his personal guard to address it directly, against, I gathered from the frantic whispers of the household staff, the strenuous objections of basically everyone, because apparently emperors were not supposed to personally attend potential armed confrontations, but Muzhan had never struck me as a man who took supposed to as a binding constraint. I was left behind, obviously, because I was a fox, and foxes do not accompany war parties, no matter how many treason plots they'd helped uncover through sheer nosiness and a supply chain auditor's eye for fraud. I hated it, I want that on record. I paced the length of my ridiculous cushion for 2 straight days, driving Xiao Lu to increasingly creative attempts at distraction. A new toy, extra treats, a very confused Dabao dragged in for company, who took one look at my agitated state and in an act of genuine cross-species solidarity, simply curled up beside me and stayed there, silent, the entire second night. Word came on the 3rd day, the confrontation had gone wrong. Not catastrophically, the garrison's rebellion had been contained, but the emperor had been injured, not fatally, but injured in a way that had the entire palace holding its breath until his return. I do not remember making the decision to leave the imperial quarters. I remember, with total clarity, the sensation of running, full imperial palace panicking nine-tailed fox sprint, past startled guards, past Fu Gui shouting something I didn't process, all the way to the front courtyard, arriving at the exact moment the returning procession came through the gates. He was upright, bandaged, pale, clearly favoring one side but upright and very much alive, and the relief that hit me was so total and so overwhelming that I did the single most undignified thing I had done in either of my 2 lives. I launched myself mid-stride directly at him, and he, despite an injury that should have made this a terrible idea, caught me without hesitation, one arm wrapping around me even as he winced. "You absolute idiot," I tried to say, and what came out was not a yip, was not a bark, was not any sound a fox should be capable of making. It was a word, a real, human, unmistakable word, in a voice I hadn't heard in my own throat since I died at a desk with a spreadsheet open. The courtyard went silent in a way I had genuinely never experienced before, not the polite, tense silence of a scandalized court, but the total, absolute silence of 40 people simultaneously forgetting how to breathe. I looked down at myself. I had hands, I had arms. I was mortifyingly, catastrophically human again, or human for the first time in this body, tangled in what remained of a set of robes clearly not designed for a fox-to-human transformation, currently clinging to the emperor of the great Chuan dynasty in front of his entire returning honor guard. "Ah," I said in a voice that cracked with several months of disuse, "this is not how I wanted this to go." Nobody moved. Somewhere behind the emperor, I heard Fu Gui make a sound like a man's soul briefly leaving his body. The emperor, Muzhan, stared at me with an expression I had genuinely never seen on him before, not once, not during assassination attempts or treason plots or the quiet grief of his father's Memorial Day. It was something raw and unguarded and utterly stripped of the composure that had kept an empire in line for years. "Tuanzi," he said slowly, like he was testing whether the word still applied. "Su Ci," I corrected weakly, my voice still not entirely mine. That was my name, before. It's a long story, possibly the longest story. I would very much like to tell it somewhere with fewer witnesses, if that's an option." There was a beat of silence. Then, from somewhere in the ranks of the honor guard, a young soldier fainted directly backward, and the spell broke and pandemonium, polite, imperial palace-flavored pandemonium, but pandemonium nonetheless, ensued. Chapter 9: The Explanation, which went about as well as I expected. They gave me clothes, eventually, proper ones, not the ruined remains of whatever silk I'd apparently torn through in the transformation, and a very stiff cup of tea I drank in one go despite it being scalding, because apparently near-death relief and public identity reveals make a person forget basic caution. The Emperor had the entire wing cleared, just us and Fu Gui, who had apparently appointed himself permanent witness to whatever disaster was about to unfold, standing so still by the door I suspected he was holding his breath. "Explain," Mu Zhan said, not unkindly, not the tone he used on ministers who'd disappointed him, just tired and careful, like a man bracing for a wound he already suspected was coming. So I explained all of it, the spreadsheet, the desk, the 9 tails and the shrine and the beetle I regretted eating on my first day, the chess game I shouldn't have interfered with, the poison I'd smelled before anyone else noticed. Months of watching him carry the weight of an empire alone, in a body that couldn't tell him any of the things I wanted to say, that had learned, slowly and against every instinct of professional detachment I'd cultivated across 2 lifetimes, that I did not want to not say them anymore. He listened without interrupting, which was, I would learn, a rare thing for a man used to controlling every conversation he was part of. "You knew," he said finally, "all of it, every night I spoke to you like I was just a fox," I finished when he didn't. "Yeah, I know, I'm sorry, I didn't know how to tell you, and then I didn't know when, and then it just kept not being the right moment, and then apparently the right moment was you nearly died and I forgot I was supposed to be a fox. You bit Minister Zhou Heng's tribute envoy over a supply fraud you recognized from a past life," he said slowly, like he was recalculating months of memories with new information. "You beat me at chess. Technically, I just stopped you from losing. There's a difference, a small one, I'll allow it's not a huge difference." Something in his face did a complicated thing somewhere between disbelief and something that looked dangerously like it might become laughter. "You let me bathe you." I felt my face go hot in a way it had genuinely never had the anatomical capacity to do for the past several months, and found that I deeply missed being able to hide behind fur. "Yes, well, in my defense, I did not have a lot of other options at the time, and also you're very committed to a task once you decide it's yours, which is either admirable or terrifying depending on the day." Fu Gui, by the door, made a valiant and largely unsuccessful attempt to smother a laugh into his sleeve. Mu Zhan crossed the room. He moved the way he always did, deliberate, unhurried, a man who had never once in his life needed to rush toward anything because everything simply waited for him, and stopped close enough that I had to tip my head back to keep looking at him, which was a genuinely novel experience after months of looking up at him from somewhere around knee height. "You could have told me," he said, quiet now, none of the earlier sharpness left in it. "At any point, I would not have." He stopped, started again. "I trusted a fox with things I have told no minister, no advisor, not even my own family. Knowing you understood every word only makes that truer, not less." "I was worried," I admitted, "that hi, actually I'm a dead office worker from another world wearing your pet's body, was going to go over slightly worse than here's a nice fox who likes ear scratches." "You held political intelligence I did not have," he said. "You uncovered an assassination attempt before my own spies did, you corrected my strategy in a chess game, and you were worried I would be angry." "When you put it that way it does sound a little unfair to you," I admitted. He huffed, not quite a laugh, but close, the same short surprise sound I'd heard from him back when I was still small enough to fit in one arm, and then, before I had fully processed that he was moving at all, he pulled me in, one arm wrapping fully around me in a way that felt entirely different now that I had the shoulders and spine to properly return it. "I am not angry," he said low into the top of my head. "I am furious that an assassin nearly succeeded because I did not know the fox curled against my ribs every night could have told me exactly which minister's household the poison traced back to. I am furious I spent months explaining border policy to something I assumed could not judge me for my mistakes when it turns out you could, and were simply too polite to say so out loud." "I judged you a little," I admitted. "Your position on the Eastern grain tariffs is genuinely bad for the record, and I have several spreadsheets worth of opinions about it that I am now finally capable of sharing verbally." Of course you do, he said, and there was something in his voice now that I had absolutely never heard directed at anyone else in the palace, something unguarded, something that sounded terrifyingly like relief. Suci. Hearing my actual name in his mouth after months of only ever being Tuhenzi did something to my chest that no amount of professional detachment was going to help me recover from. That's me, I said a little unsteadily. Hi, it's genuinely, deeply strange to finally be able to say that to your face. Stay, he said, not a command exactly, or, well, it was phrased like one because I suspected commanding was simply the only grammatical mode Mu Zhan fully trusted, but there was a question underneath it, real and uncertain in a way I doubted this man allowed himself to be very often. Whatever form, whatever name, stay. I looked at him, this ruthless, terrifying, secretly soft tyrant who had installed a water fountain for a fox based on a treatise, who had personally supervised bath time out of sheer stubborn care, who had held me through the anniversary of his father's death without asking anything of me in return, and found that the answer had honestly stopped being in question months ago. Somewhere around the third time he'd scratched behind my ears, until I forgot I used to be a person with dignity. Yeah, I said, okay, I'll stay, though I want it on record that I'm negotiating for a proper desk. I have opinions about tax policy now, and I intend to use them. You may have a desk, Mu Zhan said, with the perfect gravity of a man conceding a major treaty point. You may not bite the tribute envoys anymore, however talented your instincts. No promises, I said, and when he laughed, really laughed, the sound rusty from disuse but entirely real, I decided that whatever chain of cosmic accidents had gotten a dead data analyst reincarnated as an imperial fox, I was, against every rational expectation I'd ever held about my own life, deeply and thoroughly glad it had happened exactly this way. Epilogue: some things change, some things absolutely do not. It took the court approximately 3 weeks to stop fainting whenever I walked into a room. It took Minister Zhou Heng considerably longer, mostly because he had spent the better part of a year insisting I was, at minimum, an ill omen and possibly a demon, only to discover I was in fact a foreign soul with a background in imperial-scale logistics and an alarmingly good memory for grain surplus math. He has still not fully recovered his composure. I try out of professional courtesy not to gloat more than strictly necessary. I mostly fail at this. I did get my desk, for the record, set up in the corner of Mu Zhan's study, close enough that he still, out of what I've come to understand is genuine, uneradicated habit, reaches over sometimes to scratch behind my ear before catching himself and looking faintly embarrassed about it, which I have never once let him live down. I also, it turns out, retain the ability to shift back into fox form, a fact that has proven enormously useful for Dawn Court, where I still occasionally show up draped over the throne's armrest, mostly now for the sheer comedic value of watching Zhou Heng's face do the thing it does whenever he remembers that the fox he tried to have destroyed on day one now sits in on policy meetings in both forms, and audits his ministry's budget reports in his off hours purely for fun. The Bao remains unimpressed by basically everything, which I've come to understand is simply his baseline personality rather than a commentary on me specifically, though he did deign to fall asleep against my human leg exactly once, during a particularly long negotiation session, and I have chosen to interpret this as the closest thing to a formal peace treaty our species are ever going to sign. Xiaolu, promoted now to something like my personal attendant in either form, still occasionally forgets and addresses me as Tuenzi out of sheer habit, and I've decided I don't actually mind. It feels at this point less like a pet name and more like the name of the specific, ridiculous, fluffy chapter of my life where a tyrant fell in love with a fox before he even knew there was a person underneath the fur, and honestly that chapter deserves to keep its name. As for Mu Zhan, he still, most nights, reads reports aloud before bed, quieter now, in the particular unguarded tone he uses when it's just the two of us. Some nights I'm at the desk beside him, human, arguing with him properly about tax reform. Some nights when the day has been long enough that neither of us wants words, I curl up as Tuhenzi against his side instead, 9 tails and all, and he holds me the exact same way he always did, like it never once mattered which shape I was wearing, only that I stayed. Turns out that's the part that was never actually about the fox at all.